The summer heat pressed down on Millbrook Township like a blacksmith's iron, distorting the air above the dusty main street in shimmering waves. It was auction day in Wyoming territory, and the town square buzzed with the particular energy that comes when human desperation meets opportunity dressed up as commerce. Jacob Harrison pulled his bay gelding to a halt outside Garrett's General Store, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest after the long ride from Broken Arrow Ranch. Dust clung to his weathered coat, and his gray eyes swept the crowd with the automatic wariness of a man who had seen too much of what people could do to each other. At 34, Jake carried himself with the rigid posture of his cavalry days, though 5 years of solitary ranch life had softened the military edges into something more contemplative, more wounded. The town square had been transformed into an outdoor marketplace. Makeshift platforms displayed everything from farm equipment to household goods. But it was the smaller platform near the courthouse steps that drew Jake's unwilling attention. A hand-painted sign read "Ward Placements" in faded letters, and beneath it stood a line of children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, each one bearing the particular stillness that comes from learning that hope is a luxury they cannot afford. Jake had not come for the auction. His business was simple supplies for the ranch, a meeting with his banker about expanding the cattle operation, and back to the blessed isolation of his 10,000 acres before nightfall. He had been managing well enough on his own since Mary Catherine and little Thomas had succumbed to the fever 5 years ago. The ranch ran itself. Mostly his 15 hired hands were good men who knew their business, and Jake had found a kind of peace in the rhythm of cattle and seasons, in the endless work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. But as he tied his horse to the hitching post, the auctioneer's voice carried across the square with practiced enthusiasm. Lot 22, male, child age 7, strong back and willing to learn. Bidding starts at $3. Jake's jaw tightened. He had heard about these auctions, of course. Everyone had. The territory was full of children whose parents had died or disappeared, leaving them to the mercy of institutions that were overwhelmed and underfunded. The system called it placement. But Jake knew desperation when he saw it, and there was something deeply wrong about the casual way human lives were being bartered like livestock. He should have walked away then, should have conducted his business and returned to his ranch and his carefully maintained solitude. Instead, he found himself drawn toward the platform, moving through the crowd with the same inexorable pull that had once led him to enlist in the Union Army against all common sense. The children on the platform ranged in age and condition, but they all shared the same hollow expression, the same defensive stillness that Jake recognized from battlefield hospitals. These were survivors, but survival had cost them something essential. They stood with the patience of those who had learned not to expect kindness, their small faces masked a premature resignation. Lot 23, the auctioneer, called, consulting his ledger with the bored efficiency of long practice. Female child, approximately 3 years of age. A small figure was led forward onto the platform, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the heat. The child, who was tiny even for her stated age, dressed in a flour sack dress that hung on her skeletal frame like a flag of surrender. Her hair, which might once have been red, had been chopped short and hung in uneven patches around a face that belonged on a much older person. But it was her eyes that stopped Jake's breath in his throat. Heterochromia. One eye blue as a Wyoming scum, the other brown as rich earth, exactly like Thomas had been, exactly like his son, who would have been 8 years old now if the fever had not taken him. Child comes from St. Agnes Home for Foundlings, the auctioneer continued, his voice carrying easily across the square. Been there 8 months. Quiet disposition, no behavioral problems, suitable for light household work. In a few years. Jake watched the little girl's face as the auctioneer spoke about her like she was a piece of furniture. She did not react to the words, did not look at the crowd examining her with calculating eyes. Her gaze was fixed on something in the middle distance, somewhere beyond the town, beyond the mountains, beyond everything that was happening to her. It was the look Jake had seen on the faces of shell-shocked soldiers, the expression of someone who had retreated so far inside themselves that the outside world could no longer touch them. Bidding starts at $2, the auctioneer announced, raising his gavel with practiced flourish. Do I hear $2 for this healthy young girl? Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. Jake could see the crowd evaluating the child with the cold assessment of people shopping for value. A woman in the front row shook her head dismissively. "Too small," she muttered to her companion. "Wouldn't be worth her keep for years." "Look at those eyes," someone else commented. "Something wrong with her. Might be simple." The little girl did not react to their words, but Jake saw her hands clench slightly at her sides, the only sign that she was hearing every cruel assessment, every casual dismissal of her worth as a human being. $1 then. The auctioneer tried again, his enthusiasm beginning to fade. "Surely someone can offer $1 for this child. Think of the Christian charity you would be showing." More silence. Jake found himself studying the faces in the crowd, seeing the mixture of indifference and distaste with which they regarded the small figure on the platform. These were not evil people, not intentionally cruel. They were practical folk making practical decisions about their limited resources. But their practicality felt like a knife in Jake's chest as he watched them weigh the cost of feeding a small child against the uncertain return of her future labor. 50 cents. The auctioneer tried desperation creeping into his voice now. 50 cents to provide a home for this poor orphan child. Jake felt something breaking inside him. Some careful wall he had built around his heart crumbling like a dam in spring flood. He thought of Thomas, who would never stand on any platform, who would never face the coldness of strangers deciding his worth. He thought of Mary Catherine, who had possessed an inexhaustible capacity for loving the unloved, who would have been horrified by this spectacle. And he thought of himself hiding behind grief and isolation while the world continued its casual cruelties just beyond the borders of his carefully maintained solitude. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "If there are no bids, this lot will be returned to institutional care." Jake knew what that meant. Everyone knew. St. Agnes Home for Foundlings was overcrowded and underfunded, run by people who had long since learned to see children as numbers in a ledger rather than souls deserving of care. Children who could not be placed disappeared into the system's darker corners, and questions were rarely asked about what happened to them there. The gavel began its descent toward the wooden block. $10. Jake's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a cavalry saber. Every head turned towards him, and he felt the weight of their stares as he stepped forward, his spurs ringing against the wooden platform steps. The auctioneer's gavel froze in midair, his face brightening with mercenary hope. "Did I hear $10? The man called out. "Mr. Harrison, is that $10 you are offering for this child?" Jake had not intended to speak. The words had emerged from some deeper part of himself, the part that remembered what it meant to protect the innocent, the part that Mary Catherine had nurtured and that he had thought died with her. But now, standing before the platform with every eye in the square upon him, he felt the rightness of the decision settle into his bones. "Yes," he said clearly. $10. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $10 was more than many families spent on necessities, in a month more than twice what most of the other children had brought. Several people turned to stare at Jake with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion, wondering what could drive the reclusive rancher to such extravagance. "Excellent," the auctioneer exclaimed, practically leaping down from the platform to collect the money before Jake could change his mind. "Sold to Mr. Jacob Harrison for $10. A fine act of Christian charity, sir. Truly commendable." "It is not charity," Jake said quietly, his gray eyes still fixed on the small figure standing motionless on the platform. As he spoke, something remarkable happened. For the first time since she had been led onto the wooden stage, the little girl looked directly at him. Her extraordinary eyes met his, and in that moment Jake felt a recognition pass between them that had nothing to do with charity or commerce or practical decisions about the future. She saw him, really saw him in a way that no one had since Mary Catherine died. And he saw her not as a burden or a problem to be solved, but as a person deserving of protection and care simply because she existed. The connection lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. The auctioneer was babbling about paperwork and legal responsibilities, but Jake barely heard him. He climbed the steps to the platform and approached the child slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. When he reached her, he crouched down to bring himself to her eye level, noting how she tensed but did not retreat. "My name is Jacob Harrison," he said softly. "Most people call me Jake. I am going to take you home with me now to my ranch. It is about 2 hours' ride from here. I want you to know that I am not going to hurt you, and I will not let anyone else hurt you either. The child stared at him with those remarkable eyes, but gave no response. Up close, Jake could see the signs of malnutrition in her hollow cheeks and the way her dress hung on her tiny frame. He could see old bruises faded to yellow on her arms and newer ones on her wrists that looked like finger marks. His jaw tightened at the evidence of rough handling, but he kept his voice gentle. "What is your name?" he asked. Still no response. The child looked through him as if he were made of glass, her expression as empty as it had been when she first stepped onto the platform. Jake felt a familiar stir of recognition. He had seen this look before in the field hospitals during the war. It was the look of someone who had endured so much that they had simply stopped being present in their own life. "That is all right," Jake said. "You do not have to tell me now. We have plenty of time." He straightened and held out his hand, not expecting her to take it, but offering it nonetheless. After a long moment, she placed her small fingers in his palm. Her hand was cold despite the summer heat, and so light it felt like holding a bird. The auctioneer pressed a single sheet of paper into Jake's free hand. "Transfer of custody," he explained. "Legal and binding. The child is yours now, Mr. Harrison. Full responsibility for her care and conduct." Jake folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket without reading it. The legalities meant nothing compared to the weight of the small hand in his. He had made a promise, spoken and unspoken, and he intended to keep it. The crowd was already dispersing their attention, turning to the remaining lots and the promise of other entertainment. Jake led the child through the thinning groups of people toward his horse, noting how she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that attracting attention was dangerous. When they reached the hitching post, he lifted her gently onto the saddle, feeling how she went rigid at his touch, but did not resist. "This is Thunder," he told her, patting the bay's neck. "He is a good horse, very steady and reliable. He will take us home safely." Jake swung up behind her, settling her carefully in front of him. She sat perfectly still, her small body radiating tension, but she did not try to escape or struggle. It was the compliance of someone who had learned that resistance only made things worse. They rode out of Millbrook in silence, leaving the dust and noise of the town behind for the open grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. The Wyoming Territory spread around them in endless waves of golden prairie grass, broken by clusters of sagebrush, and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking the path of a creek. It was beautiful country, harsh, but honest, and Jake had always found peace in its vastness. For the first hour, the child sat like a statue in front of him, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Jake did not try to make conversation, instead letting the rhythm of Thunder's hooves and the whisper of wind through grass fill the silence between them. He had learned patience during his years alone on the ranch, and he sensed that this small person would need time to decide whether he could be trusted. As they crested a low hill, the Broken Arrow Ranch came into view in the valley below. It was not a fancy spread, but it was substantial and well-maintained. The main house was built of local timber and stone, solid and practical rather than elegant. Corrals and outbuildings clustered around it like satellites, and beyond them stretched pastures dotted with black cattle. A creek wound through the property lined with cottonwoods that provided shade and the music of running water. Jake felt the child shift slightly in the saddle, and when he looked down, he saw that she was studying the ranch with something that might have been interest. It was the first sign of engagement she had shown since they left town. "That is home," he told her quietly. "Broken Arrow Ranch, 10,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Wyoming Territory. Those are my cattle you see there, about 2,000 head. The horses in the near corral are my remuda. Every animal on this ranch is cared for and protected. Nothing goes hungry or cold if I can prevent it." As they rode down into the valley, Jake could see Sarah Coleman emerge from the main house and step onto the front porch. Sarah was his housekeeper and the only other permanent resident of the ranch. She was a sturdy woman in her middle 50s with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that missed very little. She had answered Jake's advertisement for domestic help 3 years ago after her husband died in a mining accident and had proven to be exactly what the ranch needed: competent, unflappable, and wise enough to ask no questions about why a wealthy rancher chose to live like a hermit. Sarah took one look at the small figure riding in front of Jake, and her expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and finally something softer. She walked down the porch steps as Jake brought Thunder to a halt near the house. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, her voice carrying the slight Irish accent that became more pronounced when she was surprised. "That appears to be a child." "It is," Jake replied, swinging down from the saddle. "Her name is Emma Rose Mackenzie, and she will be living with us now." Sarah's eyebrows rose, but she had been running frontier households too long to be easily rattled. She approached the horse slowly, studying the tiny figure still perched in the saddle. "Hello, Emma Rose," she said gently. "What a pretty name for a pretty girl. Shall we get you down from there and into the house where it is cooler?" The child. Emma Rose did not respond, but she allowed Jake to lift her down from the horse. When her feet touched the ground, she swayed slightly, whether from the unaccustomed riding or simple exhaustion, Jake could not tell. He steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She has had a difficult time," Jake explained quietly to Sarah. "She may need some patience." Sarah nodded, her practical mind already working through the implications. "Well then, let us start with getting her fed and cleaned up. Everything else can wait." She crouched down to Emma's level, moving with the careful deliberation of someone experienced with frightened creatures. "Are you hungry, sweetheart? I have fresh bread and honey and cold milk from our own cows." Emma stared at Sarah with those remarkable eyes, but gave no sign of having heard the question. Sarah exchanged a glance with Jake, her expression troubled but determined. "Come then," Sarah said, straightening. "Let us go inside and see what we can do." The interior of the ranch house was spacious and comfortable, furnished with solid pieces built to last rather than impress. Sarah led them to the kitchen, a large room dominated by a cast-iron stove and a heavy wooden table that could seat a dozen people when the ranch hands came in for meals. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through gingham-curtained windows, and the room smelled of bread and coffee and the indefinable comfort of a well-tended home. Sarah settled Emma in a chair at the table, then bustled about preparing food with efficient movements. Jake sat across from the child, studying her face in the better light of the kitchen. She was even smaller than he had thought and bore the signs of systematic neglect: hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, and the particular stillness that came from learning that making noise or drawing attention led to punishment. "Here we are," Sarah said, setting a plate before Emma. On it were thick slices of fresh bread spread with butter and honey, along with a glass of cold milk and some sliced apples from the ranch's small orchard. "Eat as much as you like, dear one. There is plenty more where that came from." Emma looked at the food but did not move to touch it. Minutes passed in silence while Sarah and Jake watched anxiously. Finally, Emma reached out with one small hand and broke off a piece of bread. She brought it to her mouth and chewed mechanically, her eyes never leaving the table. As she ate, Jake noticed something that made his chest tighten with anger. Emma was not just eating, she was hoarding. After every few bites, her free hand would sneak pieces of bread and apple into the folds of her dress, tucking them away with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned not to trust that there would be food later. Sarah noticed it too, and when Jake started to speak, she silenced him with a look and a slight shake of her head. "Let her," the look said. "She has been hungry before really hungry, and she does not trust that this will last." So they let Emma eat and hide food in equal measure until the plate was empty and her dress pockets bulged with secreted provisions. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and went still again, as if the whole process had been automatic rather than voluntary. "Would you like to see your room?" Sarah asked gently. "It has a window with a lovely view of the mountains, and there is a comfortable bed with clean sheets." Emma did not respond, but when Sarah stood and held out her hand, the child took it after only a brief hesitation. Jake followed them upstairs to a room that had been Thomas's before the fever took him. Sarah had clearly been busy while they were in town, airing out the space and making it ready for its new occupant. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a brass bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair by the window. Clean white curtains framed the view of the Absaroka Mountains, rising like purple ramparts against the evening sky. "This will be your room," Sarah told Emma, her voice warm with welcome. "No one will come in without your permission, and the door locks from the inside if you want privacy. There is water in the pitcher and basin for washing, and clean night clothes on the bed. If you need anything during the night, Mr. Harrison's room is just down the hall, and I sleep downstairs near the kitchen." Emma looked around the room with something that might have been wonder, though her expression remained carefully neutral. It was probably the first time in months, perhaps years, that she had been offered a space that was hers alone, a sanctuary where she could be safe from the casual cruelties of institutional life. We will leave you to get settled, Jake said from the doorway. Supper will be ready in about an hour, but if you would rather rest, Sarah can bring something up to you later. They left Emma standing in the middle of the room looking small and lost in the gathering twilight. Downstairs, Jake and Sarah sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the weight of what had just transpired settling between them. She is terrified, Sarah said quietly, her voice heavy with sympathy. That poor baby has been through something terrible. Look at how thin she is, and those bruises on her arms. Jake nodded, staring into his coffee cup. The auctioneer said she came from St. Agnes Home for Foundlings. 8 months there. Sarah's expression darkened. I have heard stories about that place. Nothing good. They say the woman who runs it, Mother Superior Agnes, sees the children as nothing more than burdens to be disposed of as quickly as possible. She has not spoken another word since I brought her home, Jake said. Not one sound. Trauma, Sarah replied with the authority of someone who had seen her share of human suffering. The mind protects itself by shutting down when the world becomes too cruel to bear. She may come back from it with time and patience, or she may not. We will love her either way. Jake looked up sharply at the word love, and Sarah met his gaze steadily. That is what you are planning, is it not? To love her, because if you think you can simply provide food and shelter without opening your heart, you are mistaken. That child needs more than charity. She needs to know that someone cares whether she lives or dies. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been telling himself that this was about duty, about doing the right thing, about providing a safe home for a child who had none. But Sarah, with her uncomfortable insight, had put her finger on the truth he had been avoiding. He had looked into Emma's extraordinary eyes and seen his dead son. He had felt the first crack in the wall around his heart, the first stirring of something he had thought buried forever. I do not know if I can, he admitted quietly. After Mary Catherine and Thomas, I promised myself I would never care that deeply again. The loss almost killed me. And yet you paid $10 for a child you had never seen before, Sarah pointed out gently. You brought her home and promised to protect her. Your heart is already involved, Jacob Harrison, whether you admit it or not. Before Jake could respond, they heard a sound from upstairs that froze them both. It was soft, so quiet they almost missed it, but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying, trying desperately to muffle her sobs. Jake was on his feet and moving toward the stairs before conscious thought could intervene. He climbed the steps 2 at a time and approached Emma's door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see the small figure curled on the bed, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. He pushed the door open gently. Emma, she looked up at him with those extraordinary eyes, tears streaming down her face but still making no sound. It was the most heartbreaking thing Jake had ever witnessed, a child who had learned that even grief had to be silent. Without thinking, Jake crossed to the bed and sat on its edge. It is all right to cry, he said softly. You are safe here. You can make noise if you need to. You can cry as loud as you want, and no one will punish you for it. The words seemed to break something inside her, and the silent tears became quiet sobs, then louder, weeping as months of suppressed pain poured out. Jake reached out instinctively, gathering the tiny girl into his arms, and she clung to him with desperate strength. I know, he murmured into her hair, rocking her gently as he had once rocked Thomas during nightmares. I know it hurts. I know you are scared, but you are safe now. I promise you are safe. As he held Emma and felt her small body shake with exhaustion and grief, Jake realized that Sarah had been right. His heart was already involved, had been involved from the moment he saw her standing on that platform with her extraordinary eyes and terrible stillness. He had looked at her and seen not just a child who needed saving, but a person whose worth was immeasurable regardless of what others thought. The sun had set while Emma cried, and darkness was settling over the ranch when she finally exhausted herself into sleep. Jake laid her gently on the bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, noting how small and vulnerable she looked in the oversized nightgown Sarah had found for her. As he turned to leave, he made a silent promise to the sleeping child and to the memory of his own son. He would not fail her. He would not let the world's cruelty touch her again if it was in his power to prevent it. Whatever it cost him, whatever walls he had to tear down in his own heart, he would give her the safety and love she deserved. Standing in the doorway, watching Emma sleep in the room that had once been Thomas's, Jake felt something shift inside him that he had not experienced in 5 years. Hope, frightening and fragile, but real nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to either succeed or fail in his promise to protect his child. But tonight she was safe and warm and no longer alone. As he made his way downstairs, Jake did not notice the figure watching from the shadows across the ranch yard. A man on horseback, too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to have observed the day's events with interest. The rider sat motionless for several more minutes, as if memorizing the layout of the buildings and the routines of the ranch before melting back into the darkness of the Wyoming night. 3 months had passed since Emma Rose Mackenzie arrived at Broken Arrow Ranch, and the first snows of autumn were dusting the high peaks of the Absaroka Mountains, when trouble came calling in the form of a well-dressed stranger and a piece of paper that threatened to destroy everything Jake Harrison had begun to rebuild. The transformation in Emma during those months had been gradual but unmistakable. She still rarely spoke, but the terrible emptiness in her extraordinary eyes had been replaced by something warmer, more present. She followed Jake around the ranch like a small shadow, watching with intense concentration as he tended the horses' mended fences and checked on the cattle that dotted the autumn pastures. Sarah had coaxed smiles from her with fresh-baked cookies and gentle songs sung while kneading bread, and just last week Emma had whispered her first clear words since the auction. "Thank you, Papa Jake," when he had lifted her onto his shoulders to watch the sunrise over the mountains. Jake had felt his heart crack open a little more each day, the careful walls he had built around his grief slowly crumbling under the patient assault of a 3-year-old girl who trusted him completely. He had not realized how much he had missed having someone to care for someone whose welfare mattered more than his own comfort or safety. Emma had given him back his purpose, and in return he had given her the security of knowing she was wanted, protected, and beginning to be loved. But on this cold October morning, as Jake worked in the barn, grooming Thunder, while Emma sat nearby on a hay bale, watching with rapt attention, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful routine. Jake straightened his cavalry instincts, automatically cataloging the rhythm, 2 horses ridden hard, coming fast up the main ranch road. Through the barn door, he could see 2 riders approaching the house. One was Sheriff William Morrison, a decent man despite his tendency to avoid trouble when it might complicate his life. The other was a stranger, well-dressed in Eastern fashion, riding an expensive horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his way. Emma had gone rigid on the hay bale, her small body tensing with the hypervigilance that trauma victims never quite lost. Jake set down the brush and moved to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It is all right," he said quietly. "Probably just ranch business. You stay here with Thunder while I see what they want." But Emma slipped down from the hay bale and pressed herself against his leg, her small fingers clutching his pants with desperate strength. Something about the approaching riders had triggered her deepest fears, and Jake felt his own protective instincts flare in response. Sarah emerged from the house as the 2 men dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron, but keeping her expression carefully neutral. Jake walked from the barn, with Emma practically attached to his side, his gray eyes assessing the strangers with the wariness of a man who had learned to read danger in the set of shoulders and the placement of hands. "Sheriff Morrison," Jake said with a nod. "What brings you out to the ranch?" Morrison looked uncomfortable, his weather-beaten face showing the reluctance of a man delivering unwelcome news. "Mr. Harrison, this here is Mr. Duncan Mackenzie from Colorado Territory. He says he has business with you concerning the child." The well-dressed stranger stepped forward with the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm and persistence. He was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as a man of means. But there was something in his pale blue eyes that set Jake's teeth on edge, a calculating coldness that reminded him of certain officers he had known during the war, men who saw other people as resources to be exploited. "Mr. Harrison," Duncan Mackenzie said, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "A pleasure to meet you at last. I must thank you for taking such good care of my dear niece during this difficult time." Jake did not take the offered hand, and Emma pressed closer against his leg, trembling now with more than cold. "Your niece," Jake said carefully. "Indeed." Mackenzie reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio from which he extracted several official-looking documents. "I am Duncan Mackenzie, brother to the late Robert Mackenzie and uncle to little Emma Rose here. I have been searching for her ever since she disappeared from our family home in Denver." Jake felt the world shift beneath his feet, but he kept his expression neutral through years of practice hiding his emotions. "Emma has been here for 3 months. If you were looking for her, why did it take you so long to find her?" Mackenzie's smile never wavered. A fair question, Mr. Harrison. You see, when my brother and his wife died of consumption last year, Emma was supposedly placed with a respectable family in Denver. It was only recently that I discovered she had somehow ended up in that dreadful institution and subsequently at the auction in Millbrook. Imagine my distress when I learned that my own flesh and blood had been sold like common chattel. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Mackenzie has documents proving his relationship to the child Jake. Birth certificates, family records, the works. Of course I do, Mackenzie said smoothly. Emma Rose Mackenzie, born June 15, 1882, daughter of Robert and Catherine Mackenzie of Denver, Colorado Territory. I have been frantic with worry searching every orphanage and foundling home between here and California. Jake looked down at Emma, who had gone completely pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was staring at Mackenzie with an expression of pure terror, the same look she had worn on the auction platform 3 months ago. Whatever this man represented to her, it was not the loving family reunion he was describing. Emma, Jake said quietly, crouching down to her level. Do you remember this man? Is he your uncle? For a moment, Emma's remarkable eyes met Jake's, and in them he saw desperate pleading. Then she buried her face against his shoulder, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Mackenzie observed this display with what appeared to be paternal concern. Poor child, he said sadly. She has been through such trauma being separated from her family living in that terrible institution. Children often react strangely to reunions after such experiences, but I am sure that with time and proper care, she will remember her loving uncle who has been searching so desperately for her. What kind of proper care? Jake asked, his voice deadly quiet. Why, the best that money can buy, of course, Mackenzie replied. I have recently come into some good fortune, a silver mine that my late brother invested in before his death. Emma is his sole heir, you understand, and I am her legal guardian. She will want for nothing, I assure you. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. The timing of Mackenzie's appearance, his sudden concern for a niece he claimed to have been searching for, his emphasis on the inheritance, all pointed to a truth that made Jake's blood run cold. This man had not been looking for Emma out of love or family obligation. He had been looking for her because she represented money, and he had only found her after learning about the silver mine. I see, Jake said, straightening slowly, Emma still clinging to him like a lifeline. And I suppose you have legal papers giving you custody. Naturally, Mackenzie produced another document with a flourish. Signed by Judge William Carpenter of the Colorado Territorial Court, naming me as Emma's legal guardian and commanding her immediate return to my custody. Sheriff Morrison looked profoundly unhappy with the situation. I am sorry, Jake, but the law is the law. If these papers are legitimate, and they appear to be, then Mr. Mackenzie has every right to take the child. Of course they are legitimate, Mackenzie said with mild offense. I would hardly travel all this way with forged documents. Now, Emma, my dear, say goodbye to these kind people who have cared for you. We have a long journey ahead of us, and I am eager to introduce you to your new home. Emma's grip on Jake's shirt tightened convulsively, and for the first time since that night 3 months ago, she spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. No, she whispered. No, please. Do not make me go. Jake felt something savage and protective rise in his chest, the same instinct that had driven him to charge Confederate positions during the war. She does not want to go with you. Mackenzie's expression remained pleasant, but Jake caught a flash of something cold and calculating in his eyes. Children often resist change, even when it is in their best interests. Surely a man of your experience understands that we cannot always let children make decisions about their own welfare. The papers look official enough, Sheriff Morrison said reluctantly, and blood family does have legal priority over informal adoption arrangements. Jake knew he was beaten, at least for the moment. The law was clear on such matters, and Mackenzie had come prepared with all the right documents and legal justifications. But every instinct Jake possessed was screaming that this man meant Emma no good, that sending her away with him would be tantamount to signing her death warrant. I need time to prepare her, Jake said finally. She has belongings here, things that belong to her, and she should have a chance to say goodbye properly. Mackenzie consulted an expensive pocket watch. Of course, of course. Family reunions should not be rushed. Shall we say 2 hours? That should give you time to pack her things and explain the situation properly. After the two men left with promises to return before noon, Jake carried Emma into the house where Sarah waited with tears in her eyes and the kind of grim determination that had seen her through her husband's death and the hard years that followed. "We cannot let them take her," Sarah said, without preamble. "That man is lying about something I would stake my life on it. Did you see how terrified she was? Children do not react that way to loving relatives." Jake set Emma down in her favorite chair by the kitchen window, but she immediately scrambled onto his lap, pressing herself against him, as if she could somehow merge with his body and never be separated. Her breathing was still rapid and shallow, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Mackenzie to burst through at any moment. "Papa Jake," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He is the bad man. He is the one who took me to the dark place." Jake felt his heart stop. "What dark place, sweetheart?" Emma's voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "After Mama and Papa died. He came and said he would take care of me, but he did not. He took me to the dark place with the mean ladies who hit me and would not give me food. He said nobody would ever want me because I was broken." Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal, and Jake felt rage surge through him so powerfully that for a moment he could not see. The picture Emma was painting was clear and damning. Mackenzie had not been searching for his lost niece. He had been the one who placed her in St. Agnes' home for foundlings in the first place, abandoning her to institutional abuse while he waited for some financial opportunity to make her valuable to him again. "The silver mine," Jake said grimly. "That is what brought him back. Emma is the heir, which means he gets control of her inheritance if he has custody of her." "We have to do something," Sarah said fiercely. "We cannot let him take her back to that life." Jake looked down at Emma, who was watching his face with desperate hope, trusting him to find a solution that would keep her safe. The weight of that trust was almost crushing, but it also crystallized his resolve. He had made promises to this child, spoken and unspoken, and he would move heaven and earth to keep them. "Get me paper and ink," he told Sarah. "I am sending a telegram to Evan Brooks in Cheyenne City. If Mackenzie wants a legal fight, he will get one." But even as Sarah hurried to comply, Jake knew that legal challenges took time, and time was the one thing they did not have. Mackenzie would return in less than 2 hours with Sheriff Morrison, and those official-looking papers in the law would be on his side regardless of what Jake suspected about his true motives. As if reading his thoughts, Emma looked up at him with those remarkable eyes and said something that stopped his breath in his throat. "Mama left me something. She said to keep it safe until I found my real family." From the folds of her dress, Emma withdrew something Jake had never seen before, a small locket on a delicate chain, tarnished with age but bearing an intricate engraving of a rose surrounded by Celtic knots. With trembling fingers, she opened it to reveal 2 tiny photographs and a folded piece of paper so small it seemed impossible that it could contain anything meaningful. Jake unfolded the paper with infinite care, afraid it might crumble at his touch. The writing was faded but legible, penned in a feminine hand that spoke of education and refinement. "My dearest Emma Rose, if you are reading this, then the consumption has taken me and your father as we feared. I pray that you are safe and loved, as every child deserves to be. Know that your father and I loved you more than life itself, and that we made provisions for your care should the worst happen. I have written to my dearest friend Sarah Coleman, formerly Sarah O'Brien of County Cork, asking her to watch over you if we cannot. The man who claims to be your guardian is not to be trusted. Your father discovered that Duncan has debts and enemies, and that he sees you only as a means to settle them. If Duncan Mackenzie ever tries to claim you, show this letter to the authorities and tell them to contact Judge Morrison in Cheyenne City. He has the true copy of your father's will, which names another guardian entirely. Stay strong, my darling girl. You are braver than you know and more loved than you can imagine. Your devoted mother, Catherine Rose Mackenzie." Jake read the letter twice, hardly daring to believe what it contained. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she took in the contents. "Catherine Rose Mackenzie," she breathed. "My God, Jake. Katie O'Brien. She married a Mackenzie and moved to Denver 15 years ago. We corresponded for years before I lost touch with her." "You knew Emma's mother?" Jake asked, his mind racing through the implications. "I knew Katie before she was Emma's mother," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "We grew up together in Boston before I married my William and moved west. She was my dearest friend in the world, and I wondered what had become of her." Emma looked between the two adults, hope beginning to dawn in her eyes as she sensed that the letter might change everything. Does this mean I do not have to go with the bad man? It means we have something to fight with, Jake said grimly. But we need to get to Judge Morrison in Cheyenne City, and we need to do it before Mackenzie realizes what we know. The sound of approaching horses cut through their planning like a knife. Mackenzie and Sheriff Morrison were returning early, and through the kitchen window, Jake could see that they were not alone. Two additional men rode with them, hard-looking individuals who carried themselves with the casual violence of hired muscle. He is not taking any chances, Jake muttered, automatically checking the position of his holstered Colt. Sarah, take Emma upstairs and keep her there, no matter what happens. But Emma slipped from his lap and ran to the window, peering out at the approaching riders with an expression of stark terror. He brought the other bad men, she whispered, the ones who hurt children who try to run away. Jake felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. Mackenzie had not come for a civilized handover. He had come prepared for resistance, and the men he had brought were not the sort who would be deterred by legal niceties or moral arguments. If Jake tried to fight this through proper channels, Emma would be gone before any judge could review the evidence in her mother's letter. Change of plans, he said quietly to Sarah. Get Emma to the root cellar and keep her hidden no matter what. If something happens to me, take her and that letter to Judge Morrison yourself. Sarah started to protest, but Jake was already moving his mind, shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through 4 years of warfare. He had perhaps 2 minutes before the riders reached the house, and he intended to use every second of it. The front door opened just as Jake reached the main hallway, and Mackenzie entered with Sheriff Morrison close behind. The two hired men remained outside, but Jake could see them through the windows, positioned to cover the exits with professional competence. Mr. Harrison, Mackenzie said with that same cold smile, I hope you have had time to prepare, dear Emma, for our journey. We really must be going. I have been thinking about what you said, Jake replied carefully, about family rights and legal obligations. It occurs to me that I never saw any proof that you are who you claim to be. Mackenzie's smile faltered slightly. I beg your pardon. Anyone can have documents made, Jake continued. In my experience, men who travel with armed escorts are not usually engaged in legitimate family business. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. Now, Jake, that is a serious accusation. Mr. Mackenzie has provided proper identification and legal papers. Has he, Jake asked, or has he provided papers that look official enough to fool a small-town sheriff who does not want trouble? The mask of false concern finally slipped from Mackenzie's face, revealing the cold calculation beneath. I grow tired of these games, Mr. Harrison. The child is coming with me, whether you like it or not. I have invested too much time and money in tracking her down to be deterred by your sentimental attachment. There it is, Jake said quietly. Investment, not love, not family obligation, business. Mackenzie shrugged, no longer bothering to maintain his pretense. The girl is worth $50,000 to me once I gain control of her inheritance. That is more money than you will see in a lifetime of ranching. I am prepared to be generous, however. $500 for your trouble, and you can pretend this conversation never happened. Sheriff, Jake said without taking his eyes off Mackenzie. Are you hearing this? This man just admitted that he is here for money, not family. Sheriff Morrison looked deeply troubled, but he also looked at the armed men outside and made the calculation that had governed his career. I am sorry, Jake. The papers look legitimate, and I cannot make judgments about people's motives. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, you will have to take it up with the territorial court. Evidence? Mackenzie laughed harshly. What evidence? The word of a traumatized child who has been living with strangers for months. Even if she remembered anything useful, which I doubt, no court would take the testimony of a 3-year-old over legal documents. That was when Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, still clutching her mother's locket. She had heard every word, and the terror in her extraordinary eyes was giving way to something Jake had never seen there before: determination. I remember, she said clearly, her young voice carrying with surprising strength. I remember everything you did. Mackenzie's face went white, then flushed with anger. Get down here, you little brat. We are leaving, now. No, Emma said, and Jake heard echoes of her mother's strength in that single word. I will not go with you. You are not my family. You threw me away like garbage, and now you want me back because of money. She pulled the locket from around her neck and held it up like a talisman. My real mama left me this. She said you could not be trusted. She said you have debts and enemies and that you only see me as a way to pay them. Mackenzie started up the stairs, his face twisted with rage, but Jake stepped into his path. That is far enough. Get out of my way, Harrison. The child is coming with me, and anyone who tries to stop me will regret it. I do not think so, Jake said quietly, and his hand dropped to rest on the butt of his Colt. You are not taking her anywhere. The two men faced each other in the narrow hallway, the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Sheriff Morrison started to speak, but Mackenzie cut him off with a sharp gesture. You are making a very serious mistake, Mr. Harrison. I am a man of considerable resources and influence. Cross me, and you will find that life becomes very difficult for you and anyone who helps you. I have faced down Confederate cavalry and survived the Battle of Gettysburg, Jake replied evenly. I am not easily intimidated by a man who abandons children and hires gunmen to threaten families. The tension in Jake Harrison's hallway stretched like a wire about to snap when salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. The sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop cut through the standoff and through the front windows. Jake could see a sight that made his heart leap with hope. Judge Nathaniel Crawford himself riding hard with two territorial marshals flanking him like avenging angels. Mackenzie's face went ashen as he recognized the unmistakable authority of the territorial court arriving unannounced. His hired gunmen outside shifted nervously, their hands moving away from their weapons as they calculated the odds of taking on federal marshals and decided they were not being paid nearly enough for that level of trouble. Judge Crawford dismounted with the vigorous energy of a man 20 years younger, his silver beard and piercing blue eyes giving him the appearance of an Old Testament prophet delivering divine judgment. He had been Jake's commanding officer during the final year of the war, and Jake had never been happier to see that familiar, stern face and ramrod posture. Mr. Harrison, the judge said as he strode through the front door without ceremony, we received a rather urgent telegram from a certain Miss Sarah Coleman, along with some very interesting documents that arrived by special courier from Denver. I thought it best to investigate personally. Sarah appeared from the kitchen with Emma close beside her, the little girl's eyes wide with wonder at this sudden reversal of fortune. In Sarah's hands was a thick envelope bearing official seals, and Jake could see Mackenzie's face go from pale to gray as he recognized whatever those documents contained. Judge Crawford, Mackenzie began with forced confidence, I am sure there has been some misunderstanding. I am simply here to collect my niece and return her to her proper family. Are you indeed? Crawford's voice carried the dry authority that had once commanded Union regiments. How fascinating, because according to these documents which arrived from the probate court in Denver just this morning, you have no legal claim to this child whatsoever. The judge opened the envelope and withdrew a sheaf of papers, his eyes scanning them with professional efficiency. It seems that one Robert Mackenzie, before his untimely death, discovered that his brother Duncan was deeply in debt to some rather unsavory characters. Fearing for his daughter's safety, Mr. Mackenzie changed his will to exclude Duncan entirely and named another guardian for young Emma. Emma pressed closer to Jake, her small hand finding his with instinctive trust. Mackenzie's mask of civilized pretense was cracking completely, now revealing the desperate criminal beneath. That is impossible, Mackenzie snarled. I have the original will. The girl is mine by right of blood. You have a forgery, Judge Crawford corrected calmly. A rather good one, I admit, but the genuine article was filed with the territorial court in Cheyenne City as a precaution. It seems Robert Mackenzie was more concerned about his daughter's welfare than his brother's financial difficulties. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Your Honor, I was Catherine Mackenzie's dearest friend before she married. She wrote to me before she died asking me to watch over Emma if anything happened to her. I had lost touch with the family, but when Emma arrived here, I began to suspect who she might be. And when Mr. Harrison sent word about Mackenzie's claims, you contacted the proper authorities. Crawford nodded approvingly. Exactly as a responsible citizen should. The genuine will named Sarah Coleman as Emma's guardian with Jacob Harrison as alternate should Miss Coleman be unable or unwilling to serve. The legal earthquake that followed was swift and decisive. Mackenzie's forged documents were confiscated as evidence, His hired gunmen were arrested for intimidation, and Duncan McKenzie himself was taken into custody on charges of fraud, child endangerment, and attempted kidnapping. Sheriff Morrison, visibly relieved to have the matter taken out of his hands, assisted the marshals with professional efficiency. But the most important moment came when Judge Crawford knelt down to Emma's level, his stern features softening as he looked into her extraordinary eyes. "Young lady," he said gently, "you have been through a terrible ordeal, but you are safe now. The law recognizes Sarah Coleman as your legal guardian, but she has expressed a desire to share that responsibility with Mr. Harrison, who has clearly provided you with excellent care. How would you feel about staying right here with the people who love you?" Emma looked up at Jake with those remarkable eyes, one blue as summer sky, one brown as rich earth, and spoke with a clarity that silenced everyone in the room. "Papa Jake promised to keep me safe," she said simply. "He kept his promise. I want to stay with my real family." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, cracking open the last walls around his heart and letting in a flood of love so powerful it left him breathless. This child who had been broken and discarded, who had survived institutional abuse and the callous greed of relatives, had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her. They were family, now bound not by blood, but by something stronger, the conscious decision to love and protect each other, regardless of cost. As the legal machinery ground into motion over the following days, Jake found himself marveling at the transformation in Emma. The terrified, silent child from the auction platform was becoming a bright, curious little girl who asked endless questions about everything she saw. She followed him around the ranch with infectious enthusiasm, learning to care for the animals with the same patience and gentleness he showed her. Sarah officially declined guardianship in favor of Jake, but remained at the ranch as part of their chosen family. The three of them settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing mornings, tending the livestock afternoons, exploring the vast beauty of the Wyoming Territory. Evenings by the fire with books and stories, and the comfortable silence of people who belonged together. But their story was far from over. Word of the court case spread throughout the territory, and with it came an unexpected consequence. Other desperate families began arriving at Broken Arrow Ranch, bringing children who had been damaged by the same system that had nearly destroyed Emma. Parents who had heard about the rancher who fought the law to protect an orphan girl began asking if he might have room for one more child who needed the kind of healing that only love and patience could provide. The first was Tommy Brennan, a 7-year-old boy whose parents had died in a mine collapse, leaving him in the care of an orphanage that saw him as nothing more than a burden. He arrived silent and suspicious, flinching at sudden movements and hoarding food just as Emma had done. But Emma took him under her wing with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood exactly what he was feeling. "It is scary at first," she told him seriously as they sat in the barn watching the horses. "But Papa Jake does not hurt children. He keeps his promises. And Sarah makes the best cookies in the whole world." Tommy's transformation was slower than Emma's had been, but no less miraculous. Under the patient care of adults who saw him as a person rather than a problem, he began to bloom. His laughter returned first, then his curiosity, and finally his trust in the possibility that the world might hold more kindness than cruelty. Then came Mary Sullivan, a 9-year-old girl whose mother had died, giving birth to a brother who lived only 3 days. Her father, unable to cope with his grief and desperate poverty, had abandoned her at a foundling home before disappearing into the wilderness. Mary arrived angry and defiant, lashing out at anyone who tried to show her kindness, because kindness in her experience was always followed by betrayal. But Emma and Tommy formed a protective circle around the new arrival, showing her through actions rather than words that this place was different. They shared their toys, included her in their games, and most importantly, they never gave up on her, even when she gave them every reason to. Jake watched this process with wonder and growing understanding. Emma, who had once been the most damaged child he could imagine, was becoming a healer herself. Her own experience of trauma and recovery gave her an intuitive understanding of what other wounded children needed. She was learning to transform her pain into compassion, her survival into strength that she could share with others. As months passed and more children arrived, Jake realized they were building something unprecedented in Wyoming territory. Word of their success spread beyond the borders of their region, drawing attention from territorial officials and child welfare advocates who saw in Broken Arrow Ranch a new model for caring for society's most vulnerable members. The transformation of the ranch itself was remarkable. What had once been a lonely outpost for a grieving widower became a thriving community where children learned not just to survive, but to flourish. Jake expanded the main house twice, built a proper schoolhouse, and hired additional staff who understood that their mission was not to control or contain these children, but to help them discover their own worth and potential. Emma, now 7 years old and growing into a confident, articulate child, became the unofficial ambassador for new arrivals. She had an uncanny ability to look past their defenses and behaviors to see the frightened, hurting person underneath. Her own journey from silence to voice gave her a credibility with traumatized children that no adult could match. But it was the arrival of Sophie Martinez that would test everything they had built and prove how far Emma had truly come. Sophie was different from the other children who had found their way to the ranch. At only 4 years old, she had survived horrors that left her completely mute and so withdrawn that she seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from everyone around her. She had placed her temporarily at the ranch, while they investigated, but it quickly became apparent that Sophie would need long-term care regardless of what they discovered about her past. Emma took one look at the tiny silent girl and saw herself 4 years earlier. The recognition was immediate and profound, and it awakened in Emma a sense of purpose that surprised everyone with its intensity. "She is like I was," Emma told Jake with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes emerged from her small form. "She is lost inside herself because the world hurt her too much. But I found my way back because you showed me it was safe. Now I have to show her." What followed was one of the most remarkable things Jake had ever witnessed. Emma appointed herself as Sophie's protector and guide with a dedication that bordered on the mystical. She sat with the silent girl for hours, not demanding response or interaction, just being present in the way that Jake had once been present for her. She shared her toys, her books, her favorite spots around the ranch, always including Sophie, even when the younger girl showed no sign of awareness or interest. She told her stories about the animals, about the seasons, about the way the mountains looked different in morning light and evening shadow. Most importantly, Emma began sharing her own story. In simple words that a traumatized 4-year-old could understand, she explained how she had once been scared and silent too, how she had learned to trust again, how she had discovered that some people could be counted on to keep their promises. "I was broken like you," Emma said one evening as they sat in the barn, watching the horses settle for the night. "But Papa Jake showed me that broken things can be fixed if someone cares enough to be patient. He was patient with me, and now I will be patient with you." The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Sophie's arrival. Emma was brushing one of the gentler horses, talking quietly to both the animal and the silent girl who sat nearby, when Sophie suddenly stood up and walked over to touch the horse's muzzle with wondering fingers. "Soft," she whispered, the first word anyone had heard her speak. Emma's face lit up with joy, but she had learned enough about trauma to know that celebration could be overwhelming. Instead, she simply nodded and continued brushing the horse. "Yes," she said calmly. "Very soft. His name is Gentle. Would you like to help me brush him?" From that moment, Sophie's recovery accelerated. Under Emma's patient guidance and Jake's protective care, she began to emerge from her shell of silence and fear. The process was slow and sometimes difficult, with setbacks and bad days that tested everyone's resolve, but the progress was undeniable. By Sophie's 5th birthday, which they celebrated with no knowledge of her actual birth date, but with great joy, nonetheless, she was speaking in full sentences, laughing at Emma's jokes, and showing the first signs of the bright, curious child she had always been beneath her armor of silence. The success with Sophie cemented Emma's reputation as a bridge between the world of hurt children and the world of healing adults. Families throughout the territory began requesting specifically that their damaged children be sent to Broken Arrow Ranch, not just for Jake's patient care, but for Emma's unique ability to reach the unreachable. As Emma's 11th birthday approached in the spring of 1893, Jake reflected on the journey they had all taken together. The lonely rancher who had bought a silent child at auction had become the patriarch of an unusual but deeply loving family. The traumatized girl who could not speak had become a healer whose voice carried hope to others who had lost their way. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in their understanding of what family could be. They had learned that blood relationships, while important, were not the only bonds that mattered. Love, commitment, and the conscious choice to care for one another could create connections that were every bit as strong as genetics. The ranch now housed 23 children ranging in age from 4 to 16, each one carrying their own story of loss and recovery. They had different backgrounds, different traumas, different needs, but they shared the experience of having been discarded by a society that saw them as problems rather than people, and then rescued by a community that saw their potential rather than their damage. Emma, now undisputed as the big sister of this unusual family, had grown into a remarkable young girl. She was articulate and confident, quick to laugh, and equally quick to offer comfort to anyone who needed it. Her extraordinary eyes, once a symbol of her otherness, had become a mark of her uniqueness, a reminder that beauty could be found in differences if you knew how to look. But it was her capacity for empathy that truly set her apart. Having survived the worst that institutional care could offer and emerged into the light of genuine love, Emma had developed an almost supernatural ability to understand suffering and offer hope. She became the voice of every child who arrived scared and silent, the living proof that healing was possible. Jake often found himself marveling at the young woman she was becoming. At 11, Emma displayed a wisdom and compassion that many adults never achieved. She had learned to transform her pain into purpose, her survival into service to others. She was growing up to be exactly the kind of person her mother had hoped she would become, brave, kind, and utterly committed to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The legal ramifications of their success were far-reaching. Judge Crawford, impressed by the results at Broken Arrow Ranch, began advocating for changes in territorial law that would give more weight to the best interests of children rather than the rights of blood relatives. Emma's case became a precedent that protected other vulnerable children from being claimed by relatives whose motives were financial rather than familial. Duncan McKenzie, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison for fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy. The silver mine that had motivated his pursuit of Emma proved to be largely worthless, a final irony that left him with nothing to show for his crimes except the knowledge that he had lost the chance to know a remarkable little girl who might have brought joy into his life if he had chosen love over greed. As winter settled over Wyoming territory in Emma's 11th year, Jake found himself thinking about legacy. He was now 47 years old, no longer young, but blessed with good health and the kind of satisfaction that comes from work that matters. The ranch was thriving, the children were flourishing, and Emma had grown from a silent, traumatized waif into a confident young girl whose laughter could light up the darkest day. But he also understood that their work was far from finished. There would always be more children who needed saving, more families that needed healing, more battles to fight against systems that prioritized convenience over compassion. The question was not whether the need would continue, but whether they would have the strength and wisdom to meet it. The answer came from Emma herself, as it so often did. On Christmas Eve of her 11th year, as they gathered around the tree in the main house with all 23 children and the growing staff that helped care for them, Emma made an announcement that surprised everyone with its clarity and determination. "When I grow up," she said, standing before the assembled family with the confidence of someone who had found her voice and intended to use it, "I am going to be a lawyer. I am going to change the laws so that no child ever has to stand on an auction block again. And I am going to make sure that people like Duncan McKenzie can never hurt children and for money." Jake felt tears sting his eyes as he listened to this young girl articulate a vision that was both ambitious and entirely achievable, given her intelligence and determination. Emma had found more than safety and love at Broken Arrow Ranch. She had found her purpose. "I think you will make an excellent lawyer," Jake told her, his voice rough with emotion. "And I will be proud to help you achieve that goal in any way I can." Emma smiled at him with those remarkable eyes, one blue as hope, one brown as the rich earth that had nurtured them all back to life. "Thank you, Papa Jake, for everything. For seeing me when nobody else would, for keeping your promises, for showing me that broken things can be made whole." She paused, looking around at the faces of her chosen family children who had all been discarded and then discovered, all been broken, and then healed by the power of patient love. "And thank you for teaching me that when someone saves you, the best way to say thank you is to save someone else." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth and laughter of their impossible, beautiful family, Jake Harrison understood that his legacy was not the cattle he raised or the land he owned, but the lives he had touched and the love he had shared. Emma and all the children who had followed her to Broken Arrow Ranch would go into the world carrying the knowledge that they had worth beyond measure, that they deserved to be protected and cherished, that they had the power to transform pain into purpose. Some would become teachers, others farmers, still others might follow Emma into law or medicine, or any of 100 different paths. But they would all carry with them the understanding that family was a choice, that healing was possible, and that sometimes the most important thing one person could do for another was simply to see their value and refuse to give up on them. Years flowed like the creek that wound through Broken Arrow Ranch, carrying with them the seasons of growth and change of children arriving broken and leaving whole of a community built on the radical idea that every person deserved love simply by virtue of existing. Emma grew from a girl into a young woman of extraordinary grace and determination, her path illuminated by the certainty of her purpose and the strength she drew from those early years when Jake Harrison had refused to let the world discard her. At 18, Emma Rose Harrison, for she had legally taken Jake's name, became the youngest person ever accepted to the University of Denver Law School. Her application essay, a searing account of her journey from auction block to advocate, moved the admissions committee to tears and earned her a full scholarship. But what moved them even more was her stated goal to dedicate her life to reforming the laws that govern child welfare and protection. Jake stood on the platform of the Millbrook train station on a crisp September morning in 1900, watching his daughter prepare for the journey that would take her away from the ranch for the first time since he had brought her home 13 years ago. Emma was radiant with excitement and determination, her extraordinary eyes bright with the fire of someone who had found not just her voice, but her calling. "You will write," Jake said, and it was not a question, but a gentle command from a man who had learned that love sometimes meant letting go. Every week, Emma promised embracing him with the fierce affection that had sustained them both through the difficult early years and the triumphant later ones. "And I will come home for Christmas with all my books and legal knowledge ready to argue cases over dinner and drive you all to distraction with my studying." Sarah, now in her 70s, but still the beating heart of their ranch family, dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "You just remember where you came from, child. And remember that there are 22 children back home who will be watching every newspaper, following every case, believing that if Emma Rose Harrison can change the world, then maybe they can too." Emma's time at law school was marked by academic excellence and passionate advocacy. In her third year of law school, Emma took on the case that would define her career and change the trajectory of American child welfare law. 7-year-old Michael O'Sullivan had been placed with his uncle after his parents died in a factory fire in Denver. The uncle, Patrick O'Sullivan, was well respected in the community, a successful businessman with impeccable references and a spotless reputation. But Michael told a different story, one of systematic abuse and terror that no adult seemed willing to believe. The case bore haunting similarities to Emma's own experience with Duncan McKenzie, and she threw herself into it with the passion of someone fighting not just for one child, but for every child who had ever been dismissed, disbelieved, or betrayed by the adults sworn to protect them. Working with a team of investigators and child welfare advocates, Emma uncovered a pattern of abuse that Patrick O'Sullivan had hidden behind a facade of respectability. More importantly, she developed new legal strategies for presenting children's testimony in court, arguing that the legal system had a duty to adapt its procedures to accommodate young witnesses rather than dismissing their accounts as unreliable. The case went all the way to the Colorado Territorial Supreme Court, where Emma at 21 became the youngest attorney ever to argue before that body. Her argument was passionate and precise, grounded in legal precedent, but animated by personal understanding of what it meant to be a child whom adults refused to hear. "Your Honors," she concluded, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "we stand at a crossroads in American jurisprudence. We can continue to treat children as property, as beings without voice or agency, subject to the whims of adults who may not have their best interests at heart. Or we can recognize that children are people deserving of protection, advocacy, and the right to be heard when their safety and welfare are at stake. The choice we make today will echo through generations of American children who look to this court for justice." The court ruled unanimously in favor of Michael O'Sullivan, establishing legal precedents that would protect countless other children in years to come. More importantly, the case launched Emma's career as the foremost advocate for children's rights in the American West. After passing the Colorado bar examination with the highest scores in the state's history, Emma established her practice in Denver, specializing in child welfare law and taking on cases that other attorneys considered too difficult or unprofitable. Her reputation grew rapidly not just for her legal skill, but for her unusual ability to connect with traumatized children and help them find their voices in legal proceedings. But Emma never forgot her true home. She returned to Broken Arrow Ranch for every holiday, every summer break, and whenever a particularly difficult case reminded her of her own journey from despair to hope. The ranch had continued to grow and evolve in her absence now, housing 37 children and employing a full staff of teachers, counselors, and care providers who understood that their work was not just about providing shelter, but about healing souls. Jake, now in his 50s, had grown into the role of patriarch with dignity and grace. His hair was completely silver. His hands were weathered by decades of hard work, but his eyes still held the same gentle strength that had first seen Emma's worth when no one else would. He had never remarried, finding in his chosen family all the love and purpose any man could need. Sarah, though, slowed by age, remained the emotional anchor of the ranch, the keeper of stories and traditions who helped each new child understand that they were part of something larger than themselves. Her kitchen was still the heart of the home, and her voice could still be heard singing Irish lullabies to the youngest residents when storms kept them awake at night. It was on Christmas Eve of 1905, as Emma sat by the fire in the ranch's main parlor, surrounded by children ranging in age from 4 to 18, that she made an announcement that would change the course of her life and the history of American child welfare. "I have been asked to run for territorial delegate to Congress," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had marked every major decision in her life. "The Republican Party believes that my work in child welfare law, combined with my understanding of Western issues, makes me a strong candidate for representing Wyoming Territory in Washington." The room erupted in excited chatter as the older children grasped the implications. Emma Rose Harrison, the little girl who had once stood silent and terrorized on an auction platform, might become one of the most powerful political voices in America. Jake, sitting in his favorite chair with the youngest child on his lap, felt his heart swell with pride, so profound it left him speechless. This was the legacy he had never dared to dream of, not just a child saved, but a voice raised for all children, a woman who would carry the lessons learned at Broken Arrow Ranch to the highest levels of American government. "Will you do it?" asked 16-year-old Thomas Brennan, who had arrived at the ranch as a terrified 7-year-old and grown into a confident young man planning to study medicine. Emma looked around the room at the faces of her family children who had been thrown away by society and reclaimed by love adults who had dedicated their lives to proving that everyone deserved a chance at happiness. These were her constituents, her inspiration, her reason for fighting. "Yes," she said simply, "I will run, and if I win, I will carry all of your stories with me to Washington. I will make sure that Congress understands that America's greatest resource is not its land or its industry, but its children, and that we have a sacred duty to protect and nurture every single one of them." Emma Rose Harrison won her election by the largest margin in Wyoming Territory's history, sweeping every county and demographic group on a platform of child welfare reform, women's suffrage, and progressive social policies. Her inaugural speech, delivered to a joint session of Congress in March 1906, was a masterpiece of oratory that combined personal narrative with policy vision, moral urgency with political pragmatism. "Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues," she began, standing at the podium where she had dreamed of standing since she was 11 years old. "I come before you today, not just as the representative of Wyoming Territory, but as the voice of every child who has ever been abandoned, abused, or forgotten by the systems meant to protect them. My story is their story, and their story is America's story." She told them about the auction block in Millbrook Township, about the man who saw value where others saw worthlessness, about the ranch that became a beacon of hope for children whom society had discarded. She spoke of the need for federal standards in child welfare for legal protections that would prevent children from being trafficked like livestock for institutions that prioritized healing over convenience. The speech made front-page news across America and established Emma as a rising star in progressive politics. But more importantly, it began the legislative process that would culminate in the passage of the Mackenzie Child Protection Act of 1908, named in honor of Emma's mother, and designed to prevent any child from ever again facing the horrors that Emma had survived. The act established federal oversight of child welfare institutions, mandated legal representation for children in custody proceedings, and created a national registry to track children in the system and prevent them from disappearing into institutional abuse. It was the most comprehensive child welfare legislation in American history, and it bore Emma's fingerprints on every clause and provision. But Emma's greatest victory came not in Washington, but in the place where her journey had begun. In the summer of 1909, she returned to Millbrook Township for the dedication of a monument that would stand where the auction platform had once been. The bronze statue depicted a man and a young girl, their hands clasped, looking toward the horizon with hope and determination. The inscription, chosen by Emma herself, read simply, "In memory of all the children who needed someone to see their worth, in honor of all the adults who chose to love rather than to profit, may their example light the way for generations to come." Jake, now 63 and walking with a slight limp from an old ranch injury, stood beside Emma as the monument was unveiled. The crowd that had gathered included hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Former residents of Broken Arrow Ranch who had grown into teachers, doctors, farmers, and parents. Legislators who had supported the Mackenzie Child Protection Act. Social workers who had implemented its provisions across the country. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not stopped that day? Emma asked her father as they stood together in the shadow of the monument. Jake smiled, his weathered face creasing with the lines that came from decades of laughter and love. "No," he said quietly, "because it was never really a choice. From the moment I saw you standing there, you were mine and I was yours." That is what family means, not the absence of choice, but the choice made with complete certainty over and over again on every day. Emma took his arm as they walked away from the monument, past the place where her life had changed forever, toward the carriage that would take them back to the ranch and the family that waited there. Behind them, the bronze figures stood guard over the spot where despair had once reigned their linked hands, a permanent reminder that love could triumph over indifference, that one person's courage could change the world. Years later, when Emma Rose Harrison had served 6 terms in Congress, authored dozens of pieces of landmark legislation, and been appointed as the first female federal judge in American history, she would return to that monument whenever she needed to remember why she fought. She would trace the bronze features of the man who had saved her and think about all the children who had been saved, because one rancher had refused to let the world determine a little girl's worth. The ranch still operated now, run by a board of former residents, but still guided by the principles that Jake and Sarah had established decades earlier. Jake had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the children who had become his legacy. His funeral drew mourners from across the country, but the most moving tribute came from Emma herself, who spoke of a man who had learned that love multiplied when shared, that family was built through choice rather than birth, and that sometimes the greatest thing one person could do for another was simply to refuse to give up on them. Sarah lived to see her 93rd birthday, sharp as ever, and still dispensing wisdom and cookies in equal measure to anyone who needed them. She had watched Emma's rise to national prominence with the satisfaction of someone who had helped plant a seed and lived to see it grow into a mighty tree. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to their work came not from monuments or legislation, but from the simple fact that by the time Emma celebrated her 40th birthday, over 300 children had found their way to Broken Arrow Ranch, and from there, into lives filled with possibility rather than despair. They became teachers and farmers, doctors and artists, parents and public servants, each one carrying forward the lesson that they had learned in a Wyoming valley, that every person had immeasurable worth, that family was a choice, and that love was the most powerful force for change in the world. The ranch still stands today, a reminder of what can happen when one person decides to see value where others see worthlessness, to offer love where others offer indifference, to fight for justice where others accept cruelty as inevitable. The creek still winds through the property. The mountains still rise purple against the western sky, and somewhere in the wind that whispers through the cottonwood trees, you can almost hear the echo of a promise made long ago between a broken man and a silent child, a promise that changed not just 2 lives, but hundreds of others that followed. And in courtrooms across America, in schools and hospitals, and homes where children are safe and loved, the legacy of that promise continues, proof that sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is simply to see their worth and refuse to let the world convince them otherwise. The rancher's promise, made in a moment of impulse and kept through a lifetime of dedication, became a testament to the power of love, to heal, to transform, and to endure long after those who made it have returned to the earth that nurtured them. Emma Rose Harrison died in her sleep at the age of 87, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, both biological and chosen, who carried forward her work and her memory. Her funeral was attended by dignitaries from across the nation, but the service that meant the most was the simple ceremony held at Broken Arrow Ranch, where a small headstone was placed beside Jake's in the cemetery beneath the old oak tree. The inscription, chosen from her own words, read, "She remembered what it meant to be forgotten, and so she fought to make sure no child ever would be again." And beneath that, the promise that had started it all: everyone deserves someone who will see their worth. The ranch continues to this day, evolved but unchanged in its essential mission. New children still arrive scared and silent, still learn that they are valuable beyond measure, still discover that broken things can be made whole when someone cares enough to be patient. The story goes on, as it always has, as it always will. One child at a time, one choice at a time, one promise kept at a time. And somewhere in the wind that blows across the Wyoming prairie, in the laughter of children at play, and the gentle nicker of horses in their stalls, the echo of that first promise still sounds: "You are safe, you are wanted, you are home."